Perhaps you or a friend have been directly impacted by mental illness and you know how devastating the effects can be. But even if you've not been touched directly, did you know that according to the World Health Organization, in 2019, 1 in 8 people globally were living with a mental health disorder? So the more we understand how mental illness develops, the better we can diagnose and treat it, thereby saving a huge amount of time, money, and most importantly, suffering. So in 2021, Alameda and colleagues at King's College London did a study to explore how childhood adversity or cannabis use might drive mental illness. And in particular, they wondered if a biological process called epigenetics might be a link. What is epigenetics? Well, it's best explained using a metaphor. Have you ever followed an instruction manual to put together some furniture? Well, the cells in our bodies have an instruction manual called DNA. And just like a written instruction manual has paragraphs, so our DNA has genes. Now, we've all got slightly different instruction manuals. Some of us have inherited the explanation of how to make blue eyes and some green eyes, for example. But sometimes we're born with an instruction manual that is wrong. And every time our bodies try to follow it, it does the wrong thing. That is a genetic problem. Epigenetics is where a paragraph gets altered because of external events, some outside influence. Now again, the change could be completely benign, but it also could cause problems. Alameda and the team looked at lots of different studies done by other scientists. By pulling together lots of different types of studies, they were able to see the wood for the trees, to spot patterns and links that might otherwise be hiding in plain sight. Some of the studies they looked at investigated the impact of childhood adversity or cannabis use. Some of the studies focused on the impact of epigenetic changes in just one biological process, for example, how brain cells communicate with each other. Other studies looked at people with a specific mental illness, like schizophrenia, for example, and showed all of the epigenetic changes that might be implicated in that disease. One of the particular patterns that Alameda and team wanted to spot was if epigenetic changes had transdiagnostic or disease-specific links. What does that mean? Well, going back to the metaphor of the instruction manual, imagine if the paragraph that gets altered is about how to put together the leg of a stool. Then any changes in that paragraph is only going to impact stools. In the same way, epigenetic changes may only show up in one disease. However, if the paragraph that gets altered is about how to turn a screw, then that one change could mess up a huge variety of types of furniture. And in a similar fashion, one epigenetic change could show up across lots and lots of different mental diseases. And that's what's called a transdiagnostic change. So what did Alameda and the team find? Well, childhood adversity does seem to drive epigenetic changes in the management of neurotransmitters. These are chemicals that cells in the brain use to communicate with each other. Also, it seemed to drive epigenetic changes in neurogenesis. Now, this is our ability to grow new brain cells. And finally, it seemed to have epigenetic changes in our immune response. This is the way the body tackles harmful viruses or bacteria and so on. When we have a cough or a cold or we scrape our knee, our immune system response is there to fight the nasties. But when the immune system isn't working properly, it can attack our own cells. How about cannabis use? The epigenetic changes, as with childhood adversity, seemed to impact neurotransmitters and the immune response. And additionally, they seem to impact another area called neuroplasticity. So this is to do with how flexible our brain is to appropriately alter or make new connections as it learns and deals with experience. Some epigenetic changes involved in neurotransmitters were transdiagnostic. For example, changes to do with a neurotransmitter called serotonin showed up in patients with schizophrenia, depression, and psychosis. Some epigenetic changes were illness specific. For example, those to do with a neurotransmitter called dopamine showed up in schizophrenia, but not in other disorders. Epigenetic changes relating to neurogenesis, remember that's the development of new brain cells, and plasticity, the brain's ability to flex its connections, seem to be transdiagnostic. They showed up in a variety of mental illnesses such as schizophrenia, depression, and eating disorders. The review also found evidence that epigenetic changes to the immune system was strongly correlated with schizophrenia, and not quite as strongly, but still linked to other disorders such as post-traumatic stress disorder. So in summary, thanks to this study, we've got a much clearer idea of how specifically epigenetic changes to specific biological processes might be a link between childhood adversity or cannabis use and mental illness, and how these links might be transdiagnostic or disease specific. Now this is really exciting because there might be treatments that scientists can develop that can home in on one of those specific changes to alleviate suffering. Now, as with every scientific study, there are a few caveats we need to be aware of. For example, the definitions used are quite broad. It's quite tricky to define childhood adversity. Perhaps we should look at one particular type of adversity for a particular period of time, for example. Also, the studies found it difficult to account for severity of exposure. For example, the difference between childhood adversity and child abuse. There are other drivers that might be muddying the waters. For example, when people take cannabis, they typically do it mixed with tobacco. Could that be at the heart of some of the findings? Or if people are suffering from mental illness, they may well be on medication or self-medicate with alcohol or recreational drugs, and that might have skewed some of the findings. There are also technical challenges to be considered. The studies Alameda and the team looked at used different tissue types and different approaches to measure some of the things that they were studying. Lastly, some scientists can be unconsciously biased because of the funding they've received. This doesn't seem to be a problem with the Alameda team, but it might have been something that skewed the studies that they looked at. However, as long as we acknowledge these caveats, the research is exciting. There are lots of different directions which scientists can take from here. Perhaps using the same approach that Alameda and team used for different environmental factors such as exposure to pollution or war. Perhaps being more specific about a particular population. For example, we know that biological females are more prone to depression, so gender-specific epigenetic changes warrant further explanation. The study recommends that experts in different fields collaborate to pool their knowledge. Because ultimately, hopefully, one or more of these avenues of inquiry will help the world to more effectively treat, or perhaps even eliminate, that WHO figure of 970 million people living worldwide with mental health conditions, and alleviate or eradicate the accompanying distress.